tuning in today for another show of Tom Unscripted. The world's most popular internet show for people who wake up at 4 in the morning and don't have anything better to do. Although I'm a little late today, it's 7:50 a.m. Today's date is November 18th. Coming to you from the U.S. East Coast, and we have a good show for you today. We're going to talk about potential for civil war, which is a topic we've been covering since the beginning of the COVID outbreak. But I always look for key indicators that problems may be happening, and we're going to go to the state of Oklahoma to talk about that. Got a couple different things in the news cycle I want to mention before we get into that part of the show. And just for people who aren't used to the show, just a quick introduction to what I do. I could very easily come on here and give you 2 minute snippets of what's happening in the news and be like every other person on the internet fighting for your attention, thinking you have the time attention span of a hamster. However, I think with this show, rather than taking a reactive mindset where we're just responding to news being acted upon us, which is what gets us into problems, see, what is it, Cyber Polygon, see Event, what was it, 201, they called it, the one where they planned the pandemic. All of these sort of things, that's what they count on. Instead, this show does a couple things. It looks at the news and it tries to give you holistic analysis of what's happening. Okay, sorry about that. I don't know why it cut me out, but I'm back in here. It gives you a philosophical ability to understand this. It gives you a spiritual insight, from a Christian perspective. Yeah, it doesn't like me. Dana's here. Dana's here with me as well this morning. So it gives a Christian background on what we're dealing with here. And forgive me if the show cuts out and I'm not back. If I'm back, give me 30 seconds. If I'm not back in 30 seconds, I probably won't be back. But for some reason, the phone does things and it just does what it wants to do. So, but at any rate, what we try to do in this show and what I try to do, and my fans usually like, is I'll give you usually a half hour to 60 minutes, depending on the day, of comfy analysis where we look at the implications, we look at why people do what they do. And I think we beat the system frequently in predicting why people are going to do, because instead of thinking people are motivated by ideology, we actually look into the psychology, the emotional programming, the propaganda bits, and we look ahead at what's being forecast. We look at what's going to be happening several months from now. So, as I always tell people who watch my show, if I miss something, that happens. But if something big's happening, it's very rare that I don't see it coming ahead of time. One of my claims to fame was I was actually talking about coronavirus being an issue in January, and I had a book out by February, which Amazon then promptly banned. So it's one of the rarest books out there. There's only 7 copies, and I think 2 of them are out there. Good morning, Alice. Hope you're doing well, and good morning to everyone who's watching. The Lord's blessing upon each of you today. So if you want to support the program, this is a viewer-supported show. I don't put ads up because you hate them, and they annoy me too. So, if you can help, the Venmo's at CVCPRV. Super chats are always welcome, and we thank everyone who helps the program. If you want to join the community, Telegram, t.me/Atlantic Homeland. We're over there. We're always scanning the news and figuring out what's out there. And I've been putting up a number of stories in the community page this morning. Dana put up a number last night. In fact, some of them got taken down. They were so hot. So I don't know exactly what all was up there because I was sleeping, but she tells me it happened, and I believe her because YouTube does. But it was about the lockdowns happening in Australia, in Queensland, Australia. That's where Melbourne is, right? Isn't that Queensland? New South Wales, I think, is Sydney, if I remember right. Anyway, in any case, we've been doing that, and we've been working together to try to help that. This is a shared effort by Dana and myself, and it's also a ministry. I mean, Sons of Dust Ministry is something we're starting to build up as a resistance. This idea that we have to be genetically manipulated and follow the insights of people in charge who don't know what they're doing. So let's start with some quick hits, and then we'll get into the Civil War stuff because it's going to be a longer conversation. Things that I noticed. Number one, I want to talk about the OSHA ruling that they're not going to try to enforce the mandate right now. This is good news. It's based on a ruling that comes out of the Sixth Circuit Court in Cincinnati saying that the Biden administration's efforts to impose this on the people are overly broad and are indefensible. We'll see what happens. A lot of people are thinking and celebrating, I think prematurely today, that this means the government will have to back off what they're doing. The government is not going to back off what they're doing because it's happening worldwide. And the Fortune 500 companies that employ so many people are doing this. And what they'll do is they'll find other ways to get and destroy the centers of resistance. This is a global effort. They're trying to get everyone on board. Did you see Ireland, for instance? They're going back into lockdown again. 93.7% people who've had this, not enough. They want more. Gibraltar going into lockdown. 99% people who've had this. So country after country goes to the agenda. We've talked about Austria. We've talked about Germany. You pick the country. There's always these terrible stories. There's 100 of them out there. I could spend all day talking about them, but you can find them if you want to look. Although you won't find any mention of them in the U.S. media, and you won't find.
Now, like if you don't get your third booster, like your vaccine records gets wiped clean. You have to start from
Yeah,
scratch.
absolutely. And you've seen that demon Fauci out there who's been out
Uh,
there saying to people that that ultimately the social good triumphs the need of the individual. And the problem is we all live as individuals. This logic is the logic of Stalinism. It's the logic of Maoism, and that goes to my next story, which is I'm thinking of. We're all waiting to see what's going to happen in the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. There was some news breaking. I think it was from Barnes Law, if I remember right, that right now the jury supposedly is hung because there are three jurors who are worried about the fact that there have been people taking pictures in the courtroom who are doxing the jury, who are going to go out there and threaten their
wait, for real?
families. That's what I'm hearing. That's what's all over the internet. They're going to
Get
go
your
out there.
powder bricks here.
I
Get your
know. Well,
powder
we're gonna
bricks.
get to that in a second. You're absolutely right. But this is what's happening is this is jury intimidation. The judge would have done well to not allow TV or cameras in there, and
Why
they
didn't they
should.
sequester the jury?
That's a great question, and these questions need
Because
answers.
they,
And
they sequestered juries for less high
oh yeah,
profile
no, this
cases.
is absolutely it. So
This should have
it's
been one
this
of
this
them.
should have been one of those cases. Absolutely, it should have been that, but it wasn't. And why it wasn't is another question worth answering. That this is being out there, and I want to say that to this extent, I hope the jury makes a decision based upon the evidence of the case. And by the way, if it was based on the evidence of the case, he's not guilty of because there's a reasonable doubt of self defense. Whatever you want to believe in terms of the gun laws. Personally, I believe if you want to run around with your own army, that's fine. That's my own take on it. And these days, I think a lot of people ought to have that perspective.
Well, the other side
Nonetheless,
gets to.
well, to the next point. So here's my next question about that as we watch what happens in Rittenhouse. And I think they're not going to make a decision until Friday. And I'll tell you why. Because I think they want the rioting to happen over the weekend. It's funny how things happen on whatever schedule they need to be to have the worst outcomes over and over again. But we'll watch for it today. So there were reports coming around about tons of bricks sitting around Kenosha. And what I want to know is this, and here's my question, because I know you all watch this program because you come and talk to me. So to my friends at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I have a hot tip for you. Antifa is going to descend upon Kenosha, Wisconsin, and commit violence. Now, if you had American patriots going to just protest in Washington, you'd be proactively locking up their leaders to prevent problems. Here is an opportunity for the Federal Bureau of Investigation to demonstrate that they are not just a political apparatus of the left wing agenda and the globalists in America. You know that the poor people of the city of Kenosha, Wisconsin, which, by the way, is not a rich city, are going to be experiencing violence that's going to be primarily driven by the left wing. And you have the opportunity to stop radical dissidents from coming in there who are going to commit violent acts. I know that your leadership says Antifa is an ideology, and then, that you can't go out there and you can't attack an ideology, even though they have about 1,000 books groups on Facebook, which, by the way, never get canceled. Funny how that works out, if you make anything that's right wing. So here's my tip to you, and I appreciate that, Christy. Antifa is the FBI. You may be right about that. This is an opportunity to demonstrate once again that you have some volition to do things separately. But I'm sure the people who thought that way probably left about the time the government started mandating the vaccine mandate on all the people who were working there. So I just want to know, at what point are they ever going to go out there? Because they didn't do it in Portland, they didn't do it in Seattle. They're literally describing what happened in Washington as the worst terrorist attack in history. But somehow it's been memory hold that they took over blocks of Seattle for how many weeks was the chop shop operating? Do you all remember that? I remember that, and they were nowhere to be found. Well, we needed a governor to come in to kind of help us, to do these things. Well, this is an opportunity to demonstrate some leadership. And you know what? You're not going to. And I know you're not going to. And this comes to the point of where I want to go with this story, which is that when the federal government basically serves to just help one side against the other, which is what it does, and you could argue maybe it's because the left knows how to use power and the right doesn't. You could argue it's because the Republican Party's controlled opposition. By the way, remember how all you people were so excited that the Virginia governor was a Republican? He's not going to stop any county from putting on mandates on whoever they want or whatever school district to go ahead and get this injection. What a surprise. A milquetoast GOP Carlisle Group Republican gets elected as a valve for public dissent, and all of a sudden the same agenda comes through as it always did. Who told you that was going to happen? I did. But you know what you remember? This idea that, oh, well, now we can win with our guys. We'll just get better guys in 2022 and 2024. These are not your guys. They spend years setting these guys up as fall guys. I mean, if we really want to get into it, Trump was the ultimate setup as the fall guy.
A lot of
If you
guys
really
say
want to
that, yeah.
understand that, And I tell you what, when this is all done, I was listening to Mike Adams. He had a really good point. And he said, and he's too much of a Trump apologist, in my opinion, but he said this. He said if Trump doesn't get out there and begin speaking against these mandates and speaking against these injections, that people are going to turn on him. And you know what? If you're looking at this situation from outside the United States, and we have some international viewers here, if you look at this, what are you going to conclude? That the gain of function research began at the University of North Carolina of Ralph Barrett, that the NIH under Anthony Fauci funded this research going back 15 years in some cases, that the American government overwhelmingly supported our businesses like Pfizer, like Moderna, like Johnson and Johnson in promoting these things worldwide. And now we saw a court filing from the FDA asking that they not be required to release the test samples of the experimental data survey by Pfizer until 2076. So what is in there that they need to literally keep this stuff secret longer than the JFK thing? Oh, by the way, and the Biden wouldn't let that out either. So what I'm saying is they're lying to you. And if you haven't figured it out by now, you're probably a little bit dense and you're probably not watching this channel. But I'm sharing all of this with you because I'm asking a question we're not asking. How easy will it be to go out there and say that Pfizer is to America what Bayer was to Nazi Germany? That we are literally looking at where the world opposition could be turned against the United States, by the way, rightly, for the actions of our government, for supporting the woke ideologies that are causing color revolutions worldwide, for the pharmaceutical interventions that will be seen as biowarfare. And you know what? China's been making a case that this was done to them. Now, I'm not here to defend the Chinese Communist Party, but if you really want to look at the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, that goes straight back in the line to Wall Street, and you need to begin understanding those relationships. And people will rightly conclude that this comes back to America because something like this doesn't happen if America isn't on board with it. And when it does, people are going to look and say, who enabled it? Well, who else could it be but Donald John Trump, who was sitting there saying, oh, this is the greatest, most beautiful thing ever, Operation Warp Speed, you know? And it's been warp speed to what? To change reality. That's what warping is, distortion, you know? Go from one place to another. In the New World, do you like the New World Order? Do you like Build Back Better? And we're told, oh, well, you know, these are just issues and don't blame him. He needs to be blamed. And Joe Biden needs to be blamed. And all these people need to be blamed except the people who are standing up and sticking up now for what is right. And that's something you absolutely need to understand. America is having, in a lot of ways, it is a fascist government. Absolutely. There's an intertwined relationship between the Federal Reserve, the CDC. What are the chances that HIV is a lab creation? I remember, and some of you may remember, back in the 90s, a lot of people thought that that was an effort by the CIA to handle population control in Africa. There's a ton of evidence that is, and this is more relevant to the situation. It's not something I've covered, but other people have done the work on it if you want to look. A lot of people, about 5 years after the fact, 2003 was the big outbreak of SARS, if I remember right, in Hong Kong. And they started looking at SARS really carefully, and SARS as well as MERS, which came out I think in '07 or '08. You know, I can't remember exactly, were examples of this sort of beta testing on this class of viruses that were being weaponized, because coronaviruses like this were never that bad for people. But they began doing more research on it, and that's why, in fact, in China, they had a really bad outcome. And remember, the CIA has been heavily, as well as MI6, if we want to get into it, that's the British people, have been heavily involved in Hong Kong for a lot of years. So something to keep an eye on. There's a lot of evidence that biological engineering of these weapons viruses have been going on for a very long time. And the problem is that, you know, the idea is that you always have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone did something. And the fact is, the fact that we see things that had never been out there before coming out in mass numbers should cause people to pause. I mean, who here believes that the governments of the world actually give a damn about their own people? I certainly do not. I mean, they've shown that over and over again. I mean, like Dana was saying, and I believe she was posting and has been consistently posting material from Australia as the canary in the coal mine. You know, we were watching a video of a quarantine camp being set out outside of Brisbane. You know, in if I remember right, Brisbane's in northern Australia, isn't it? I should know my geography down there better. I apologize that I don't. But like this thing looked more built in than a max security prison. And it's for people who are traveling, why would you want to travel there? I mean, it's terrible. And in lockdowns, I was reading that the Australian Open, what's its name, and Djokovic is not going to even participate because people are being boxed out of the system. Okay, so that's the bad news. So here's the interesting news. So let's get to the actual point of the show now that I've ranted and got myself all worked up to a tizzy. The state of Oklahoma has an interesting situation happening, and this is the main theme of the show today. We're going to talk about what happened there with the National Guard. And Governor Stitt, who's down there, has gone ahead and said, in support with, I believe, the state legislature of Oklahoma, a very right-wing conservative state, obviously, that they are not going to mandate the injections for the people who are living in that state who serve in the National Guard for the state of Oklahoma. And so for those of you who don't know how the National Guard works, the National National Guard is technically under the authority of the governors of the different states. The Pentagon administers it, and they can send them abroad, but the governors have to release them. So every state, if you want to think of it, the National Guard is a bit like the official state militia of this. So what happened is that Oklahoma is now looking very seriously, and I believe they're going to go through with it, that they are going to say, we are not going to mandate this. And the Pentagon has pushed back under Lloyd Austin and the Marxist mob over there and saying, well, if you do that, you will be decertified and you'll just be another militia, which is sort of interesting because basically this is the first sign you will see that an official state entity, that is the state of Oklahoma, is contemplating building a military, which would now be the National Guard in Oklahoma, which would probably change its name to the Oklahoma State Guard or what. I don't know what they change it to. Maine actually used to have a state guard before 1972, so there's precedent for this, and a lot more if you go back further into American history, but you don't have to go back that far. And it would actually be under the authority of the governor. It would not be in the chain of command of the Pentagon, and it would be directly opposed to what's happening. This is a big deal, and from what Governor Stitt was saying in an interview that I read, at least one other governor has been in contact with him. And I'll just tell you, it doesn't take a long. One just has to look at a map for about 5 seconds to understand if Oklahoma does this, it won't be long before there's a drumbeat of pressure in states like Texas, Arkansas, maybe Louisiana. I think so. Let's see, that you would have, I would suspect Kansas and Missouri as well, probably not Colorado and New Mexico, but you now have the functional center of a new state and a center of authority. And I was reading on enough Forbes, Lord knows, if they went ahead and said they're going to create a separate state militia that's going to resist what the Pentagon's doing, the amount of volunteers that would travel nationwide to go ahead and defend that place would be absolutely stunning, because there's probably about 80 million Americans who are pissed off beyond any shadow of a doubt about how this country's been running, and they've been looking for an excuse and a means to organize. So it's interesting, and this could be a big turning point that's seen back in history, much like how South Carolina and nullification led to the first Civil War. Oklahoma separating its military from the national apparatus, if in fact that happens, may be the first step. Because just think of it for a second, okay? Let's just spitball what could happen. How about all those SEALs that got knocked out? Maybe Oklahoma will choose to have elite guard units. Maybe that's it. Or Missouri. I mean, Christie's here; she could speak to that. My understanding is the state of Missouri is pretty good on these things. I could see, someone in Missouri, or I could see the Texas Rangers be a bunch of Army Rangers who left, who were able to go ahead and continue their rank, continue forward. And hey, maybe one of those states might say, now that we have weapons, we don't have to continue sending money. Maybe now we're going to nullify other things. We're producing energy in Oklahoma and in Texas, in a refinery, maybe. Texas has that big gold depository, right? They can go ahead and do things, and they could begin building the foundation of a separate state. Because what seems like, and this goes back to the OSHA mandates, is they've realized that doing this at the federal level can only be done through coercion and trickery and through the threatening of force. So you have governors in left-leaning states and purple states and who are establishment rhinos going ahead and pushing these mandates, as we see worldwide. But if there's leadership who will go forward, and I mean, I don't know all the governors down there. I don't know if Abbott's one of those people who I think kind of tries to seem the right way, but I think he's a little soft. The people who live in Texas tell me, what's his name? Dan Patrick? Dan Patrick, I think is his name. The guy who's going to be coming up next is real hardcore, and he's probably going to be the next governor in Texas, from what I'm hearing. That's something we would expect. And by the way, Republicans are going to win. There was polling that came out. Was it the Berenson Group put that out? And it says Republicans heading into the midterms are plus 11. So it basically means people hate the leadership. There's a lot of rumors, I don't even know what to make of them, about the 25th Amendment floating around, that Joe Biden was trying to get Kamala Harris tossed out of office, that the House may get rid of Joe Biden altogether, and then you have Harris and Pelosi. Imagine that. What is it? A privileged shrub and a privileged scrub, right? These sort of things can happen. But one of the things we talked about, as you'll remember, those who have been with us some time, going back to Coronavirus Central, I said to you, there would be centers of power that would form, and that these would represent where the fighting in America would happen if people organize. And I said the 5 states you got to keep an eye on are California, Texas, Illinois, Florida, and New York. Florida and Texas represent the recovery, basically, of the Old South, and they've been leading the efforts against the mandates in a lot of ways. I would argue DeSantis has been a lot stronger than Abbott, but basically the whole Southland and the Midwest would want to go ahead and support those things. So keep an eye on that. It could evolve. And I think with Oklahoma, I mean, we'll see if this gets walked back. Everyone's going to pretend to play nice, but the moment that this administration pushes in a little more, the people do not want a leader to play nice. And here's the thing about it. There might be someone who isn't a system guy in there. Maybe there's a lieutenant governor. Maybe there's something. Maybe someone sees a political opportunity that they're going to go forward with, especially with governors in big square states in the center of the country. country. The minute militias become separated from the federal line of authority, which, by the way, if you're someone who's hardcore AV, right, and you have all those AV people, and let's say that people who have that start having problems, all of a sudden you may have two opposing militaries facing each other on the lines of who has it and who doesn't. Now, maybe this is just a pipe dream of someone who's AV thinking that we're going to need some ability to organize ourselves, but I'll tell you what, the people are already there to support it. You're looking for institutional leadership. And to the people of Oklahoma, I hope that, in fact, encourage your governor to do this. Encourage this to be the way forward. And do not look to Washington for a solution. Do not look to the well paid think tanks to go ahead and lead us out of this mess. They're not going to do it. The problem is Washington. There is no fixing it. The Constitution is not the answer. I've told you before. And as a Christian, let me tell you this. This is very clear, but I've said it. The First Amendment is an enshrinement of idolatry. For the people who live in the Midwest and the South who understand, who are by and large, who are leading this, are good Christian folk, you understand exactly what I'm talking about. We need to build this on a different foundation because the sort of multi-culti law and tyranny model has not worked. There has been no justice. The bigger the Department of Justice gets, the less justice people get. And that we need to begin taking those authorities back. Even in Maine, you wouldn't think in a state like this, we took back food sovereignty. We've taken a lot of things. It's too bad that New England tyranny being such as it is, we believe that communities can tell people what to do, and it's a problem. But we live in the Northland. We're always going to be more communitarian. However, we're looking to our brothers in the South to show leadership here to come out of this thing. And what happens in Oklahoma will bear watching in the next few days and few weeks as we see these mandates begin being pushed through here as we go into later November and December. There's also a big lawsuit to keep an eye on. I think there's 26 people, mostly SEALs, but other elite special forces who are fighting this, saying that these mandates are utterly beyond any ability to be imposed, that it's illegal. And, I'm not in every detail of the court case. Hey, good evening, Superficial. Let me say hi to everyone else who's here. Bro, good to see you. Janet Yellen as the next president. God, let's hope not. Um, I've heard a National Guard general claim to be the militia of the Second Amendment. And I'll tell you something that's interesting. If you had the National Guard in a state have a militia, the local militias would probably agree to sign up as volunteer regiments. I mean, I know some militia guys, and I know they think that way already. They would be very happy to have that structure come forward because that would allow them to continue. The biggest impediment for them, I'll just put it to you, is they almost unilaterally work on a constitutional framework to the point where I think it's self-defeating. Because I'm a secessionist. I've said that. That's no secret. I want northern New England to be separate. And, if something funny ever happens, if the Russians ever go to war with us, by the way, Putin was saying that. He said if America goes to war with Russia, it will be war everywhere. He said that the other day. And it's an interesting statement that, the idea that the American homeland will be spared the deprivations of war as we've been in every other conflict, for the most part, is something that would be illusory. Because with Russians, submarines, Arctic bases, hypersonic missiles, you could have the major cities of the U.S. gone in about a half hour. Not that I'm, hoping for that, obviously, but it's something that's a real possibility. So as we look at what's happening in the news cycle today, what's the story is that some people have optimism that maybe the corner's been turning and maybe that, these mandates are proving too onerous and they're going to be stopped. But I don't see it that way. I see it, if any way. Did we actually? I'll answer your question. That's a harder question than you think. Yeah, you do need to buy my books, though. That's true. Although my books aren't going to give you the best answer. Some of the stuff is a little trickier, but we'll go into that because it's an interesting topic for the second half hour, and I want to go into it. We'll see how deep I go into it. I'm not sure, but I wanted to finish this up before I get into it, and I'll offer my perspective, which, by the way, it's a dissonant perspective on the Constitution and how it happened from a very New England point of view. Because in studying the history of New England, I learned some things about the Republic I didn't realize, which is why I'm a big fan of John Adams and not so much of Thomas Jefferson. And maybe it's a little bit overwrought, but we live the places we live and why they happened, and it goes back to separation of church and state issues. But for the moment, here's what's important, what we need to look at. What we got to look at is states making moves to separate themselves from the federal structure. And the big step for a state to take will be if they decide they're not going to remit their taxes to the federal government. A lot of times the states collect these things and they can begin building alternate structures. I would love to see, by the way, rather than the Republican Party, I would love to see parties that were either state-based or regional in nature where they say they're going to break away. I'd love to see a Pine Tree Party up here in Maine, for instance, that says Maine could do its own thing. We would be much better served. And don't make it a left-wing, right-wing thing. There are left-wing issues that are fine. Like up here, for instance, marijuana is legal. It's fine. Or the idea we want to help people with a certain amount of things, fine. I mean, none of this woke crap, but I mean, there are things where they're legitimate needs of the people who live here, food and welfare and all those things we can look at. And people will have different perspectives, but whatever makes sense for your region. If you live in an area that's more collective, like we do, you're going to think you want more of that. Think like Norway. Or if you live in a place that's more, individualistic, like the South by and large is, you'll think of it differently. All right. So that is a quick glimpse into what's happening in the news cycle today. Like I said, Rittenhouse, we may have the jury decision today. If that happens, violence is basically being promised. And I will say this, and the media tells a lie, well, violence could happen either way. No, it's not going to happen either way. The right wing never riots. If the right wing ever rioted, things would probably be a better thing. But the problem is they don't, because they care about law and order, and they don't want to be thrown in jail without a key for going out there and saying things. And that's the truth of it. The right is afraid of law enforcement, and law enforcement only selectively enforces things. It's a real problem in the right. This is why the right has to organize in self-defense and organize. Like I've said to people, if you're going to go out there, you need to go out there with the balance of force, with enough people where you don't agree to be arrested. And I understand what I'm saying by that. I understand exactly what I'm saying by that, and I'm saying it exactly that way, where you just say, I do not recognize your authority. And why would you, by the way? Why would you? This is personal secession, right? That's what we're talking about. But I mean, how many of you are already at this point? And even if you live in another country, I have my friend up in BC who was sharing some information with me there. This is a case that you guys got to keep an eye on. They're running out of food up there. Vancouver's the biggest port in Canada. They've got their main highway that's going west to east that is now shut down because of a major weather event and mudslide. And weather events are strange. I was listening to another guy. He was saying they had 4 tornadoes the other day on Long Island, more than they've ever had before. Extreme, strange weather. I don't know. Something to keep an eye on. Last point, and I want to hit this softly, but I think it's really important. I just can't cover it here, is I want to know the purpose of the people who are being spiked. And for those who don't know what spiked means, is that people who have not been injected, who spend a lot of time around people who have been, especially recently, have a series of negative effects. And the question is, what damage is that doing to the people who don't go ahead and have these things? Is it designed as an effort at a minimum to keep us from associating and communicating with one another? Is there permanent damage that's being done? What kind of issues you have? Because we see the myocarditis, pericarditis, all these issues becoming much bigger. The other weird thing is people are watching the purple lights thing. So let's keep an eye on that too. There's been a lot more videos about that. Dana was talking about that 2 months ago. She's always way ahead of the curve. I don't know how she does that. Probably because she listens to more media than I do. She's better. Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm trying to feed the dog.
All right, she's trying to feed the dog. So.
She whacked me with her tail.
Oh, well, that's fine. She can do that.
Things like a whip.
Yeah, it is. All right, so let's go into the second half of the show. Just a reminder. So I gave you a little background on Civil War. If you have questions, you want to go for it. I'll take some of your questions here. We'll go to about 40 minutes here, and we'll see if there's more content than that. And if there's not, or if I hit the wall, because that happens sometimes, we'll continue forward. So you guys asked. I want to make sure I answer the question that was asked here. Did we actually lose the American Revolution, or do I just need to read your damn books already? So, in my book, someone has to say it. I talked about how America was subverted from the moment after the revolution ended. And at that time, I was still of a perspective of a positive view of the American Revolution. As I went further forward, and as I did my work for New Albion, which was this idea of a secessionist state in northern New England primarily, and the Maritimes of Canada, we really would make sense as our own sort of thing. And I in another world where it was calmer, I was going to write a history of an alternate war of 1812 where that broke off, which would be really different and interesting. What I found was the period between when the Puritans started landing in the early 1600s to 1780s was very different in New England. New England operated very well because it was basically an outgrowth of the Puritan War. No, what? Well, you don't necessarily have to learn French. I like French, but that's just me. I get along well with the Quebecois. But I will admit, it probably, and I've said this before, but it probably is a bridge too far to bring the English and French together. That problem is just that's insolvable, and I've kind of given up on the idea of including Quebec. But we'll leave that. That's a long story going way back that isn't really relevant to what I'm saying. But the English Civil War is an interesting break point in history. It was kind of a stand against tyranny by a populist religious movement. The Puritans under Cromwell, eventually under Cromwell, he wasn't the original leader of it, but it was interesting because no one wanted to to actually depose the king, Charles the First Stuart. And we're talking, just to put it in time frame, you're talking about the mid 1600s, the same time that you're seeing this religious emigration that started in the United States. Now, originally, people don't realize this: the Puritans and the Mayflower were not sailing for Boston; they were sailing for Virginia, but they got lost along the way. And John Smith was actually responsible for checking out multiple places. You probably know of his story from Roanoke and whatnot. But the history of the Cavaliers is a totally different story that has to be told in a different time. And it's not my job to tell the story of Virginia here because, frankly, I couldn't do justice to it, even though I know the sort of broad things. Although, if you are interested in the history of Virginia, what you should read about is the life of Alexander Spotswood, who was key to actually opening up the exploration of the West. Because one of the things that happened was they feared, in Britain and France combined, they
No.
believed that the colonists were actually a threat to their further
You're,
future
you know, you're,
hegemony.
you know, you're laying on your bacon, right?
Oh, that's fine. Oh, why did you bring her in here while I have
She
food in here?
busted in here, and you were.
All right,
Who,
I'm trying to tell a
yeah, but
story.
who lays on their bacon?
Well, I do apparently. Just set this. There's chick. Just put that somewhere else for now. Okay, so what I was saying was there was an effort. There was a combined effort by the English crown and the French crown. Because remember, these people were interrelated and intermarried, and they agreed to have wars against one another because the same bankers controlled them both. The Jesuits had greater control over the French, the Bank of England over that, but the Bank of England was funded by Venetian nobility, which were linked by the Roman nobility. You start to figure out the picture. What ends up happening is you end up thinking at the end of this, all right, it's the Catholic Church and the Florentine bankers. And there were bankers in Germany too, but the people in the Hansa ultimately got their money from Italy, and it goes back to old money and occultism. But suffice it to say that they didn't want to have colonists going to the center. And you remember you reading all those stories when you were a kid, how one side would set the Indians or the Native Americans, whatever you want to call it, the tribal people, against the existing colonists. And that happened over and over again. One of the most dangerous wars, for instance, if you read about it, is King Philip's War in New England, where New England lost a huge chunk of its population, and New England had a burst of growth from about 1610 to I think the war was in 1680, if I remember right, around then roughly. I might be off by a decade or so, but the basic storyline's the same. What ends up happening is that the efforts between the great powers against one another set the natives against the colonists, and that they ended up killing a bunch of people. And every time they tried to get beyond that, they would go ahead and box them in because they didn't want the prosperous colonies. Well, why did that happen? All right, because during the Puritan Revolution, they had an amazing, it was called the New Model Army. Cromwell had it, and they were basically kicking ass. They were going ahead and they were pushing
Awesome.
forward with a Protestant Bible based revolution that was
Okay.
resisting very aggressively. And it had allies too. It had allies in Germany and other places. And this was put down pretty ruthlessly through the efforts of banking and through the efforts of the international elites. And that's why you see the Glorious Revolution, where Charles II Stuart comes in there, and in fact, England ends up becoming more and more oppressed. And then after him, you eventually get, after Anne, I think it's you get William of Orange, who was brought in as basically as a Dutchman to fight wars endlessly by the Marlborough family. And the Marlborough family, you might know them. The Duke of Marlborough, actually his last name is Churchill, the same Churchill was in South Africa with diamonds and the gold. So the people who were in charge were basically
No.
trying to create a debt-based war structure that went forward so that the governments and the elites of their countries could be controlled by a different structure. This does not start with the Rothschild Bank like a lot of people think in 1815 after the Battle of Waterloo. Although, was it 1815? Yeah, 1815, June 1815. So what actually ends up happening is the Bank of England, which is the key to this, starts in the late 1600s after the Protestants have been put down, after the idea of biblical order is destroyed, and to go ahead and enslave the state to debt management by the idea of endless war, and then you end up with the what was it called? Not the 100 Years' War. I think it's the seven. No, the War of the Austrian Succession. That's the war where Spain represents Austria because it's the Holy Roman Empire, where Britain and France all get drawn into this gigantic war where they're in so much debt that they have no other choice but to service the bankers going forward. And this is when the bankers really started taking control. And it's also when the bankers began slapping things on the colonists, like Franklin was talking about later, where they were taking away their ability to make colonial scrip. Okay, so when that comes, when the colonies were wealthy, when they could control their own money supply, they were not wealthy when they couldn't. And so all the talk about the Act and the Stamp Act, that was kind of misleading. Ultimately, it was about who was going to control the money. Same thing as we deal with here. The other problem you had is that in New England, especially, the reason New England was successful, New England was much more successful than Virginia and all these other colonies at first. The reason is because it had a state church. And I know that sounds weird to you because we're taught that theocracy was terrible, but they had social order where through the town meeting, they would agree and do things collectively, where they had a shared belief of what was true. And they went ahead and they went every Sunday, and they were a good and moral people who dedicated their effort, as read in the Mayflower Charter, to the idea of of God. So what happened is, as always happens in history, people get wealthy and people get bad. In New England specifically, it was probably the trade of rum and of beers that ended up causing the problem in a lot of ways. But ultimately, even as late as I think the last state church abandoned in 1820, that the idea was that New England was actually fighting to go ahead and be free of what was happening in England and to realize its old destiny. But the problem was that within the American Revolution, the Masonic order kind of won out. And why do I say that? When you look at what was pushed through in terms of the eventual American Revolution, when we look at the Bill of Rights was built on sort of Rousseau's notion of this idea of absolute human liberty, but it was liberty minus virtue. It's a telling case that in the case of every American, I believe, at least when they were made, I don't know if it's still the case now, but every American state constitution goes ahead and enshrines God in one way or another in terms of what they have. And in fact, you even see this in the Articles of Confederation, where they said the supreme architect of the universe, right? And that's kind of an interesting question, because who talks about architects? Well, people who talk about keystones and who talk about, the symbol. You see that G for gnosis that comes from the Masonic Guild. So they had been pushing this. So they went ahead and they pushed in the Constitution, which took power from the states. And the first thing it did was it forbade religion, but it forbade also this idea of morality at the center of the state. And it said instead, well, we're just going to realize something that they had been talking about since going back to Francis Bacon, that America would be what they called the new Atlantis, and that the bankers always had their controls in, and they tried several times and were successful. Primarily, if you really want to know, you get into the later history of through Alexander Hamilton. I'm convinced Hamilton played a much bigger role. He was the one who backstabbed Adams out of office, got Jefferson in there, and as you went forward with those things, now Jefferson's celebrated as a hero, and certainly he's a very eloquent speaker on liberty. But when you look at what people with Jefferson and Paine were responsible for, they were supporting the worst terror of the Jacobins in France. So in the same way that the 60s free speech liberals, you might say, oh, well, they just wanted to talk. Well, yeah, they wanted to talk, but they don't want you to talk. And that's what ended up happening, in my opinion, with the American Revolution. What would have been better? It's hard to say. I could see a thing where the North and South would have been separated and they would have went down different pathways. The book Albion's Seed is sort of an interesting one about it. And I don't, it's very dangerous to retell history in light of modern awareness. But the bottom line is, for New England, what ended up happening, and that's the area I studied, was New England in the post-religious period adopted Unitarianism, which is religion through good works, telling others what to do and enforcing it by law. And that ultimately ended up being the primary doctrine of the United States. It evolved in transcendentalism, the idea of humanism and man looking out for one another, and led directly to the Civil War. The fact is, slavery would have probably ended within 10 to 20 years just because of economic reasons with the cotton gin and whatnot, and it would have went away, but instead they get into this war, and the bankers got behind it, and that's why Lincoln actually ended up having, one of the things he did that was good was he made treasury notes, and that was probably one of the reasons he ended up getting assassinated by Wilkes Booth, because they wanted to go ahead and use it as an excuse to get America into the debt processing system. They didn't ever really manage it, though, until they got to the various panics, and then you get to the time of the Federal Reserve and the creature of Jekyll Island and all the stuff that those of you who've studied dissident history would be aware of. But the bottom line is that this idea that you have money, you have the original formulation of the United States, which the New Englanders espoused, and I think the Virginians agreed with, is that we were an idea that we would be a land based on virtue and liberty in that order. They transformed it in the Constitution to the idea of liberty and justice. But whose justice? Well, it would be the justice meted out by the state. The Supreme Court took authority by Marbury v. Madison over the individuals, and the state has been accumulating power ever since. So if you think solutions are going to come from Washington, that runs directly against American history. The reason America had a great future is because the people with talent fled to the frontiers. And if you look at where good ideas came from in the U.S., you will see it's where there were few people, but there was great innovation. California used to be a far better place than it is today. Texas became a better place, and I would argue, sadly, New England became a place that was less good. As much as I love our culture and as our homeland, we haven't had good ideas in a very, very long time. What we've had is a corrupt, sordid establishment. Running through the Ivy League universities. And, if you want to get into that, you can see one of the things that made it even worse was after the war, they imported a lot of the second-rate intellectuals who came over here, whose only claim to fame was being victims, and they displaced the old WASP establishment that at least had an idea of civilization and hold the line. And once they took over, they made sure that no one else would go in. As usual, people who were living in the existing places, whether it be at institutions or here, let people in. So the same thing that happened with Hart-Celler immigration in 1965. 1945 happened with the population of the Ivy League universities. And once those were the dominant scholars, and you had the sort of cultural Marxist school come forward, it wasn't going to be long before this all went away. And now you have a full left wing establishment. And you know, it's interesting. The universities were always meant to be sort of the center, the universe, right? The center of where learning was. But they were once also religious institutions, and we lost that. So now we have morality without spirituality, or we have something vague like support of love and humanism, which, you know, frankly, if you've studied your Bible, is the synagogue of Satan. You know, it's all it is. It's the idea that God. I mean, if you want to put it on an axis, people think of spirituality today in the secular world as love versus hate. But there's two other axes that need to be considered, which is holiness versus wickedness. And God is love, but God is holy. But if you make God love and you don't make God holy, then what you end up with is love can be just as easily wicked. And it ends up being wicked, where it ends up being the force of oppression. And you look at this, I mean, you really want to get into the philosophy of it. Look at how so many people approach sex is just one example. That it's force, it's subversion, it's taking others, you know? I mean, the whole BDSM scene is a sign of that. It's people taking self violence out of a world where they don't fit because love is something that seems obsolete. So these are sort of things that, you know, people need to be aware of and think about when they look at it. But that's sort of, I mean, there was a lot more in that. If you want to ask questions, I'm happy to offer color to it. But I am not a fan of the American model, having studied it. I think that America is too big to be successful, and I think that if there ends up being a breakup, that we would be better off having confederation of friendly powers who work to keep external powers off this continent. But I mean, look, and I've traveled a lot. I grew up in Phoenix. I went to school in Pennsylvania. Spent a lot of time in the South. I grew up in the West, and now I live in the far Northeast. Good people, different people. Good fences make good neighbors, good borders. I think the Southland wants to do its own thing. I think it has every right to do so. I think that's smart. I think New England needs to do its own thing. We need to reflect and do things differently. We need to have our collectivism serve our people. But we're all fighting the same enemy, which is this globalist collectivist BS that's coming from transhumanists that comes out of the cities and comes out of the colleges. And that's why a lot of people look at this thing and say, hey, they're crazy. They're going to get themselves in a war. Russia's going to blow the cities off the map, or maybe the Chinese will subvert it, and then we're going to start anew from the hills and the woods. And you know, the if this isn't the end of all things, which by the way I think it is, just because of the role that technology is playing in supplanting biology. I think that's the single biggest reason why I believe that, beyond any prophetic interpretation. But let's say it isn't. I think that the future will be of the rural folk fighting for the restoration against city dwellers who are counting on automation to save them. And I think we're getting to that battle. And in that sense, it's not surprising that a place like Oklahoma, that's heavily rural, has lots of small towns and has sort of good common sense, would be leading an effort towards something that could maybe make something change. And you know, you see studies out there, the number of people who support secession and different ideas, because you can't fix this. I mean, you can't fix the fact that people have been propagandized for years and years and years. At some point, you have to kind of shake the dust off your shoes and think, who am I going to work with? And you know, it's hard because moral people don't want to go to war with people who are immoral. And I think, and I get the problem there, but I think at this point, if you're not practicing, like what I say, a culture of exclusion based upon principle, that and for me the principles are simple. I associate with people who support God, and specifically who support Jesus Christ as our Savior, having died for our sins and having risen on the third day, to give us the opportunity for salvation through grace. Um, and I support people who don't take the genetic intervention. And you know, I've softened in a little bit in this because there've been some very good people, some of whom are friends of the program, you know, who we want to look out for, we want to care for, we want to pray for. We ask you to pray for repentance. You didn't know, I get it. And you know, maybe that means something. Can't say if it does, that's for the Lord to decide. But for those of us who are going to stand against this, and for friends, you need to be able to work with people. We need this, but we need a center. And we don't have a moral center in the West. All we do is we chase the money, and we find our societies are chasing these openings. And like I said in my little spiffy video I did yesterday, I was talking about Karens and midwits. Is I think a lot of people just aren't smart enough to know they're being tricked, and that they can't keep track of things, so they trust that they don't trust the science. They trust the social mainstream to be the safest place for them to be because they don't know how to be on the fringe. They don't know how to be an outlaw. I've been a dissident. It sucks. I mean, it's hard work. No one's ever happy with you. When you're right, you get blamed for it, saying, "Why didn't you do anything?" When you're wrong, okay, the chickens come back into the picture. When you're wrong, I guess Pippa's coming forward. We're trying to heal this chicken. She has a problem with her bum, so she's in here for a little bit of work today. Um, And that's fine. And on the other hand, if you, if you don't get it right, they'll be like, "Well, you don't know anything." Well, like, what can you do? If I went out there and I tried to organize, I mean, I've tried to organize. All I do is I get phone calls from DC. I mean, I'm so sick of seeing things coming out of 202 to me. I mean, it's just like, what do you want? Like, well, what are you trying to think about this? I'm like, I don't know how to save civilization. What are you thinking? What you get for your next paycheck? I mean, and it's so thankless. It's exhausting. And the people should know better. And you know what the worst thing is? A lot of them do, and they stay in it for the paycheck. And you know what? That's going to be, you're going to have to answer to the Lord Jesus. What did you do with your life? Well, I was defending the law. So you were defending the wicked against the just. And you know what? I know people don't like using moral language, and you're not comfortable with it. But you know what? I have no problem doing this. I'll tell you what's wicked. All of these ideas that rabidly sexualize people are wicked. All these things that reduce the value of a life to just dollars and cents are wicked. All these philosophies that treat war as a profit model are wicked. And it's not a left wing perspective or a right wing perspective. I'm not a leftist or a rightist. I mean, I believe in conventional morality. I believe in the Christian message. But hey, it's pretty radical when it comes to some of the economic models. I could sit down. But the idea is there's so much self hatred in this idea that if you really want to get into the deep philosophy of it, what happened is it's not that the world doesn't believe in good, it's that the world doesn't believe in evil. And because we don't know what evil is, we can't know what good is. And we believe that our nature is just something to be supported. And we just believe it's love because there's no holiness and there's no wickedness. It's just whatever you want to do whenever you feel like it. And it's really convenient for each of us until it's a disaster for all of us. And that's the crisis of the West. So what are they trying to do? The technology is going to make it worse. And part of that's pharmacology, dumping birth control in the water, the fluoride, all those years, people were making fun of those people for things they do. Well, you think you're impervious to what's being done to your biology? Stick your head in a microwave and see what you can do. Think happy thoughts and see if you make it.
So gay frogs are real.
Frogs are real.
Gay
That's
frog.
absolutely
Gay frogs
true.
are real.
All right. Thank you, John. I will take a look at that. I did see that came in. I just wasn't answering it. So let's see. Let's look at your comments here because you're hearing me rant. I got to learn my French again. My French is really good. Usually, people with labs are trying not to feed the dog. I raised a guide for them in Canada. They love to eat more than they breed. Yeah, I mean, with Cassie, because people have asked about Cassie quite a
Yeah,
few
she's
times.
underweight. So
She's underweight. I mean, where she was at the Amish farm, I think she needed to eat more. I mean, it's not like we want to perpetually do that, but her ribs were too pronounced for what we liked. We
yeah,
wanted to do that.
I'm
And
letting her eat like pretty as much as she wants to in a day, just to put on some weight. 'Cause
yeah.
she was
Plus,
really
lean
thin.
times are probably coming. So if we
Yeah.
can get our dog up to weight, that'll be good. I tell you what, she moves fast when she starts hearing something in the woods. She's off like
She runs like a horse.
yeah, she does. And she's good at leaping too. But
Oh,
I
it's
mean,
hilarious watching her jump over trees.
it is good. Hey, good morning, Greg. Hope you're doing well up there.
I'd love to go for a walk, but I just feel so awful.
It's so snowy out there, yeah, but we'll see. Russia's gearing up for a huge offensive. Russia may be. I mean, that's very possible. And if that war happens, if Russia goes to war with the United States will lose that war. I'll tell you right now, because Russia's going to fight to win that war, and the United States is going to fight this stupid hybrid war. Russia's sick of playing around. They've realized you can't work with the West. All you can do is destroy the leadership. And I don't think Russia hates the American people. I actually think in a lot of ways, the Orthodox people have a better understanding of the base structure of American culture, but we are trapped underneath a system that is against our interest. And if you ever forget that for a moment, just wait and watch how they lie and do different things. Christie writes, people love the change of their oppression. They believe the propaganda. They keep you safe and run the economy. They do. Absolutely. And the more they've bought into the lie, the more they'll defend it. It's absolutely the truth of it. So, Cassie, where's the cowbell? Good morning, Patrick. Good to see you. And Christy writes, we're paying for the war on men. Yeah, men don't know how to fight anymore. And it's hard because you know what? And I'll tell you, I've been the guy in the front line, and people write nice messages saying they're going to support you because you can look at my history if you want to see. I'm not afraid of picking a national battle. But the problem is no one will back you. I mean, people will just say, wait for the moment. And everyone who can do something is waiting for things to fall apart. And that's why this Oklahoma thing's so interesting to me because we've reached a point now where maybe there's an opportunity for something different to come forward. Hey, Tim, good to see you. Glad you're here this morning. So we got a full house this morning. I know you guys like the later shows. I don't usually do them, and I probably won't be able to do them too much in the future because I have some other things I'm going on.
Tim's the one that writes the poetry, isn't he?
Sometimes, yeah, but Tim's more of the art guy. He does really cool art. You remember
There's
his work.
somebody in your group
He does do poetry sometimes, yeah.
that writes that really
Yeah.
the really deep sort of existential poetry that I
Yeah,
like.
no, that's
Is
Tim.
that him? Is that
Yeah,
you,
that's Tim. Yeah, Tim.
I
Tim's a talented guy.
Write more poems, Tim. I like them.
So there you go. Dana's supporting Tim's poetry. And actually, it'd be good if we had artistic talents, but instead, what do? We just go fight each other for money and control. So, and that's the American way. That's the American model, and we need something different. So, one of the things that I'm continuing to work on, and I haven't worked it out, but I'm talking to some smart people, is how we build something as an alternate model. Because the problem is when this all falls apart, if you can bring external actors in, and I think this is kind of the end game if you really want to know from foreign countries, the UN forces. The UN forces are some combinations of the bankers and or Chinese, and what they want to be able to do is build a social credit score system everywhere and impose that on people, but they need chaos and disorder. And that's why the biggest reason they can't let opposition form is because that opposition could become an order that opposes it. But if we're all stuck fighting for ourselves individually or separated and we don't have a common ethos, we have no chance. And that's where we are. I mean, you might have little fortress communities that go ahead, but ultimately there's not really much to it. And look, I've tried to organize. We're not allowed to use technology, and people don't know how to go face to face. And I don't know how you solve that. And even when you do, what happens is, I mean, honestly, you have any dissident meeting, it's like that Michigan militia. What they had, like 13 guys there. One was retarded, and 12 were feds. I mean, what a great experience. It's nice to see when you're trying to make false flags to fit the narrative over and over again. And at this point, you know what? No one's going to feel bad when this falls apart because, who will be blamed when people write the history? If there's a history to be written, they will blame the first responders. They'll blame law enforcement. They'll blame the military because they fought the wrong enemy. And this is what happens over and over again. We keep believing the state is here to save us. But this is the problem. Christie writes a great comment here. We need a hero, just one great hero or sacrifice good person. What they do, and this is what I've learned, they don't allow you your hero. What they do is they destroy that. They create evidence. They destroy. But they were good people. I mean, I hate to say it, but this is the truth. The alt right was full of people who tried to be heroic, and all of them were shut down, castigated, and the media won the battle because people didn't want to risk their ventures on people who stick differently. And I'm not saying they were all good people, but at least they were actually willing to fight for something. And if you try to be a hero, I mean, the problem is the right needs exceptional leadership. The left is a collective horde. Okay, and exceptional leadership can be decapitated. You can kill someone, you can discredit someone, you can throw them in jail.
Evil always wins because good is dumb.
Hey, don't question Dark Helmet. Don't go over his helmet. You know what I mean? My Ivy League church. If I was going to form a church, I tell you what, I think in a Puritan mind, and I wouldn't be an Ivy League church, but I would go ahead. And the Sons of Dust is just this. It's much more like the Fremen in my own mindset when I think about it. It's this idea that we need to go ahead and stand together as a community in support of Christians and an exclusion of the world that doesn't want us. We are enabling the people who hate us. We need to enable one another. I mean, maybe the answer is this. Maybe we find the perfect piece of land, take a couple thousand people and squat on it and say, this is ours now. Come and take it. I mean, honest to God, I mean, it's a little bit like for those who know South Africa and those who don't, that's an interesting example of what we might be dealing with if this goes long term because it's a country in decay that hates its own founder stock. What you might end up seeing is you might end up seeing something like Orania, where people went ahead, ORANIA, where they built a separate community, a plantation. They basically fenced themselves out from the world and they're taking care of one another. And that's what we're going to need because this is not getting better. And I suspect if those communities come to exist, they'll exist in three places: Appalachia, the Heartland, and in the Rockies. And that's where those people live because they're hardy, they're close to the land, and they can be independent. But they'll also be targets. I mean, look at what's been happening all the way going back to what's your face, the ugly one, Janet Reno. Going back to what happened in Waco, going back to what happened in Ruby Ridge, how they went after Bo Gritz. I mean, the history of all of these things that if you go back and you study the Patriot movements of the 80s and 90s, people came back from Vietnam and they knew it was a terrible war. The best of the boomers were not totally unaware of things that had happened. It's that the government built its own security apparatus. The ATF became a much bigger entity. And people would say, well, they're just trying to keep the peace. Peace at all costs is the ideology of slavery. That's all it is. It's like, I am not going to resist if anything depends. And one thing I will say about the founders, love them or hate them, they were willing to fight. And we are at a point where people are going to be asked that question again. And the only question is, are we going to wait till they come door by door to take people who are saying, oh, well, we're not going to do this? Because in Australia, they're already training and teaching the military to go do that for people who aren't on board with this agenda. They're talking about doing that in Germany. Papers, please. Achtung. This is all coming back. And it's not one country, it's every country. And that's why you got to wonder what sort of horrible thing is behind all this. It's really, really bad.
I showed you that one video with the double fenced in
Oh yeah, I talked about that. That was the
quarantine. Yeah.
Brisbane one. Yeah, that was terrible. We
What
didn't you put
the
that? Didn't you put that
world?
in the community group?
I did. That was
So you can find it if you want. It
terrible.
is terrible. It's absolutely atrocious. I know about the Great Jedi because I've read the Legacy comics. I'm such a dork. The Great Jedi believed in balance not only in the Force but every other aspect of the galaxy as well. Yeah, I mean, and this is something that has to be said. Someone's going to have to get their hands a little dirty, and and I hate to say it's going to have to be Christians, and in support of one another. We don't pick fights, but we have to be willing to defend our own. We're going to have to recover something that we've lost since the Crusades, and it's kind of funny, those of you who know my background just a little bit because I've talked on the show, is my actual minor is in medieval studies. No, no, it's not medieval studies. It's in political science, but I have all the credits for medieval studies because this is what I studied. What happens when civilization falls out of an empire model? And what happened was they recovered the truth, and they actually had a very stable, happy society. It was only the Black Plagues that came from, once again, commerce that caused the problem that spread around from the Crusades. And people don't realize the first Crusade kicked a lot of ass. I mean, it's not popular to say, oh, the poor Muslims. Yeah, not the poor Muslims. Muslims have been responsible for more slavery than anything in history. We talk about how bad the West was. The biggest slave port in history was in Zanzibar. That's off the coast of Tanzania. And what it was 90% of the slave trade went into the Islamic world. That's what it was called, the Mamluk Empire, submission, the Ottomans and their Janissaries. And to this day, slavery was only abolished, I think, in Saudi Arabia in the 1950s. And if you think it doesn't happen today, you should look what the Filipinos who work there make. But that part of the world you're not allowed to question because what's happening is the evil system is destroying those which actually offer a vision of good and of human decency. And that's something we need to recover. And I'm not endorsing what happened to the West. I mean, it's interesting why slavery happened. It was a Spanish priest in Mexico, actually, called Bartolome de las Casas, who said, hey, the Indians keep dying from all these terrible diseases like smallpox because they've never been for it. And it's worth mentioning smallpox now since that's been coming up in the news about our vaccines for a disease that supposedly disappeared in 1981. But we see that, and they said, well, maybe we'll bring some blacks over so the Indians won't die. And that's actually the story of how the conquistadors led to the sort of problems that came in Latin America, where they took the people from West Africa. And when I say took, they were sold by their own tribesmen. I think you need to understand that as well. And who actually maintained the ships. Well, it's kind of interesting to see which merchants were actually involved with that and who owned who. Not endorsing any of it. I'm against slavery as a universal, evil. But it's interesting when you know the history of why it happened and sort of the resource allocation model that ended up happening in there. But in New England, at least, we didn't do that, and that's why I think we were successful as opposed to like southern cone countries like Argentina. I love Patagonia, and it should have been another bright light in the world. It should have been like Australia or New Zealand before, all the stupidity, but it didn't happen that way because the rich landed elite made sure that there weren't small property holders, and because there was no wealth and prosperity, everyone ended up being servants, and servants just don't give a damn. I mean, why would you? The wage slave revolt thing is a real thing, and that also is another piece of this. That people are so divested from this, and if you want to build a whole society, you need people who are totally divested from it, and the leadership is basically getting ready to jettison the rest of us in terms of what they're going to build. But for the rest of us who are still here, we need to begin organizing our alternate models for it. And I need to do better in this. And I say that every episode, but it's just like, it's pretty hard because as I joke, and I think Dana will attest to this, I'm very good at understanding big picture issues, and I'm probably not the best person at running my own life. I mean, I have so many chores I have to do in a given day that, these other people, they get paid $100,000 to sit at Harvard and plan how to destroy society. I literally have to scrimp to figure out how I'm going to get $100 to put gas in the house, and so that I can make sure that we feed our chickens. So it's just one of those things, and I'm not, I don't expect it to be easy. That's fine. I don't play games on easy mode. I mean, I beat Civ on deity, so I'm pretty happy about that, but it's a challenge because our leadership doesn't have institutionality and it doesn't have support. I mean, I have some support because you guys are generous. You give through the Venmo at CVCPRV and you buy the books, and that's what keeps me afloat. But even then, it just barely. And this isn't a complaint or anything. You guys do what you can, and I appreciate it. We're very grateful for every gift. I tell you, as much as some people sometimes send big things, it's the woman and the man who send 10, $20 that means a lot to us because we know what it means. Because we're those people too. I mean, we give, sometimes we give our last dollar to someone, and that's a Christian message. But if you care about people above money, you'll have a different structure of society. And then if you have enough people who think that way, maybe you can do something differently. And maybe we just need to add some force to that. Maybe that's the answer. We make things really complicated, but they could be a lot simpler. And that's kind of what happened when we couldn't control our money anymore. So when hyperinflation comes, you already see it coming. When you can't buy food, I put a story in the community page. Tyson Foods is going to be raising chicken and meat prices up to 38% in some cases for people. You can't afford that. And what's your salary going up? Well, it isn't. Oh, food stamps went up, $20 this month. I mean, people aren't going to be surviving. People who had unemployment, the pandemic insurance, and they say, well, you need to go work harder. The answer isn't people go making $15 versus $12. The answer is a fundamental restructuring of society where you have work have meaning. And we need to go back to what we used to have, to be honest with you, where a single person's wage could support a whole family, because we need to build the family back as the center of society. We need to have men and women not at war against one another. But ultimately, this is what happens when you have this idea of rights above all else, that you have licentiousness rule your culture. And that's what happened, because I think the American Constitution opened the door to that world, because this separation of church and state is complete BS. And if you don't believe me, look at how China conducts its warfare. Do you think its government and industry are separated, or do you think it's no accident that the states subsidize the crap out of industries so now everything comes through there? It's total warfare between groups of people, and this is where it comes back to the idea of your tribe. The people who share your beliefs, the people who share your blood, the people who share your cultural and folk pathways. That's the nations that need to exist, but we don't have a nation anymore. We are a state, or more accurately, we are an empire without a nation. We have nations that could exist, and we have opportunities that can come forward. And what comes out of nations? A lot of times nations come out when empires break, holy orders come forward, and different leadership groups form different nations along cultural lines of a shared belief, and that's how the new civilization starts. That's how Islamic civilization, for instance, went into Turkey and Egypt and North Africa, the Berbers. These were places where, like, St. Augustine were from. And in the same way, a Christian rebirth could maybe accomplish that. And that's what I think we need. But it's going to be an effort to get there. In any case, hopefully you found some value in my thoughts today. Kind of a wandering show in the second half, but definitely
Oh,
things out
you
there.
should talk about the series we've been watching,
Which
the
one?
Thief in the Night series.
Oh yeah, so
It's so
this is. Why
good.
don't you post a link to the first episode? We've been watching this series from starting in the 1970s, went to 1980s. It's called Thief in the Night. It's a 1970s take from a small Christian ministry in Iowa of what the Mark of the Beast would look like. And leaving aside the differences in technology, if you accept that what's happening with the COVID passport system has real similarities to it, it's kind of fascinating to see how much they actually kind of got right. And in a lot of ways, it really can inform someone to think, because this idea, the end game of this is that you are being asked to not be fully human. You're being asked to be part of a collective. And what starts with a woke ideology becomes a technological commitment for health and safety. And eventually they'll have some horrible disease. This is pretty easy to predict. That they're going to have the cure be some sort of technological uplink where you have maybe nanobots take care of you. Um, and you're going to have to decide, do you want to be part of the machine, or do you want to be separate? And being separate is going to carry a very high cost. At a minimum, you're going to be an exile and ostracized from society. If it gets worse than that, you'll be targeted and guillotines. Think about that. Some people have been talking about those FEMA documents going all the way back to Jade Helm and those things. And I believe they'll kill lots of people, because they always do. This is what utopians believe. And the evil power they seek of living forever, they have to offer blood sacrifices. And you see this over and over again. But as you watch this sort of occultism flow through, it's interesting to look at other perspectives from a more wholesome time about how innocent they imagine this be, because the satanic evil of our regime is that it's hidden in plain sight, and it's this inducement thinking we can just go back to what was before that prevents people from acting, and that good actors in support of compromised causes are preventing other good actors from going forward. So think about the consequences of what you're doing. You are now a mercenary. If you haven't realized yet, whatever job you have, you're living in a world where law and order have broken down. There is order and there is law, but it doesn't exist in terms of supporting anyone or anything other than those who have force and violence put behind it. And what are you supporting? If you think about that, you can maybe make some better decisions. And that's one of the things we'll talk about in the future. But it was a fun series to watch. We're going to finish, was it movie four? There were four
Right,
movies.
yeah.
And I'm not going to claim it's great cinema. It's not. But it's
It's
interesting.
poignant.
It is poignant. It has moments where you're like, damn, they were still talking about that. And life. It's funny. I always say, if you want to understand the end, you got to go back to the beginning. That's what Christ said. He said, in the days of Noah, that's Genesis 6. You go back and you look at these things. We are fighting battles that have never been resolved. And ultimately, the battle, my friend John sent me something from an Orthodox friend saying the battle we're fighting is against our own nature, and our own nature recognize the evil within, and that we have to face our own evil to defeat it. We have to be aware of it. We have to admit it. We have to own it, and we have to go past it and try to do some good in this world and try to reach one another. And that's why we come out into the program. I come talk to you. I share this until they shut me down, because one day they're going to. They have to. Otherwise, it can be a focal point. And I just managed to be abstruse and abstract and wandery enough that they kind of let me go as a crazy hermit. Just because I'm crazy doesn't mean I'm wrong. A quick prayer and any last minute questions y'all have. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank everyone for the community we've built here, for the fellowship. We're instructed in your book that fellowship is something we should seek, that we shouldn't be afraid to reprimand and inform one another, and we do that. So we have the opportunity to grow, that we have a chance to grow in Christ, see in his message the opportunity for us to build a new future for ourselves, and recognize that, as he said, the goal is to be citizens of heaven, and to do that by accepting his sacrifice and following his word. So in everything we do today, we ask that, Lord, you give us the instruction of what you would have us do, and how to use our gifts and talents to advance your kingdom, which is the kingdom we're all awaiting now as we watch all these other things of the world fall apart. We know that Satan was given authority as prince of the world for all the different kingdoms, and that you rejected that. And I pray you give us the courage to do the same as we see these different threats, and also these benefits that are offered to us, And we understand that things are going to get worse, and then things are going to get a lot better. And just because something is good, something we would enjoy versus something we would hate, doesn't mean that it's any less of an inducement to give up what you have given us, which is that we were made in your image. So, Father, we thank you for that, and we just hope that you help lead us home. So, in Jesus' mighty name, I pray that for each and every one of you. I pray the blood of the cross over each of you so that you can be safe, and I will be back with you again tomorrow, unless there's anything else. Do you have anything you want to add, dear, before I depart? Okay, so Dana says goodbye. Dog, you want to come over here and come on camera for a second? Everyone I asked about seeing the dog. Come here, dog. Come here. All right. Say hi, dog. Say hi, dog. There you go. Dog's right there. She's being good, sitting in bed. Hi, dog. Okay, dog's in the camera. Dog doesn't really want. She's kind of confused, but she's pretty calm. Oh, there she goes. She's moving a little bit. So Cassie says goodbye. We named her Cassandra. Bonus points if you know why. I know one of you know why, but if you studied your Homer, you'd know why I named her Cassandra, because it's the life we live. Sometimes you see things coming, you can't do anything about it. So, like I said, God bless each and every one of you. You guys have a good day. All right, bye. All right, I can't hit the end button.